Welcome to Connecting the Dots, a non-traditional legal program with your host and trusted advisor, Liz Myska, your guide through the web of life's dilemmas.
Welcome to Connecting the Dots. I'm Liz Myska, and today I have two guests, Betsy Austin and Rebecca Wild-Wesley. Welcome, ladies.
Thank you
for having us.
The theme of today's program is an illustration of a life care plan. Now, if I was a viewer, how would you explain a life care plan to me? And if you could, Betsy and Rebecca, tell me a little bit about your professions as well in answering that question.
Wow, that's a loaded one. How long is the show?
It's my understanding that a life care plan is a financial and resource plan for people who are either aging or have had some sort of a physical or mental disability.
And I just want to chime in as a lawyer. It's a set of documents that that encapsulate or capture what's happening in a person's life after a catastrophic event, whether it's a chronic illness or disease or an accident. But
Right.
Betsy, Rebecca, from your standpoint, as an RN, and I know you had a litany of letters after
my name.
So I would like to explore that as well. But
Sure. Well, I am a registered nurse and have been so for about 40 years, but I was really young when I first became a nurse. So I have a master's degree in gerontology, which is really about the care of people who are aging. And I'm certified as a care manager, and until recently known as a geriatric care manager. And recently our profession has undergone a name change, Aging Life Care Professionals, which really applies perfectly here because life care really is an agreed upon term in the industry, and we're recognizing that life has a continuum to it. It's not an end state, and people who are perhaps born with a disability or arrive upon having some kind of disabling condition or a life-limiting condition are all of a sudden thinking about the future more than the rest of us who tend to be kind of motoring along thinking that, you know, good things will happen all of our lives and they will be long. But the person who really has to embark upon planning for the rest of their life are people who all of a sudden hit a hard wall. And that usually is related to a diagnosis. But sometimes it's related to having a child who has a disability, and you know right away as parents, their life plan is going to change as well as looking at what their children are going to have to go through, and that child who has a diagnosis that will change their life.
I'm curious, Betsy, if I can include you, because I see this in my practice. If a child is born with an ailment, are the parents more receptive to assistance from various professions as opposed to a child who suffers, let's say, a football injury or jumps into a pool and suffers an injury?
I think it's hard. I think we take this on a case-by-case basis. Different families are more or less willing to integrate care and community into their family than other people are. So I don't think we can make a dichotomy, establish a dichotomy like that. I think it really depends on how families and people are willing to integrate those kinds of services.
Can you, because you made me think automatically of a cultural difference too.
Sure.
But can you just elaborate a little bit more concerning, a family dynamic?
Absolutely. I identify myself as a health psychologist, so I often work with patients and with families who are coping with catastrophic illnesses or diagnosis, as you described. There are moments in a life where things get complicated, whether they be along a normal lifespan trajectory or not. I tend to come in those moments. And different families have different ways of negotiating with complexity and negotiating with challenge, depending on how they define their roles and responsibilities within the family. So yes, family dynamics always play a role. And often the healthcare providers become part of that family system as well.
The healthcare providers, the physicians,
care
therapists?
managers, therapists, attorneys, all of these professionals become part of the family system as people are moving through that.
Right. And I would
lifespan
say it's a
development.
real challenge because those are families who are really struggling to be able to maintain all the roles of being family, and we have to be careful to be professionals as well as being part of this system that shores them up to be as strong as possible. So we're not family.
Right. So
We look like family
right.
sometimes.
Exactly. So how do you maintain that objectivity? I think because that's what I hear you saying.
And that's what they need.
Right.
Is for us to be objective. I believe for us to become embedded in their family doesn't do them any good. We need to be able to stand back and be able to give them professional perspective, equip them, give them tools to be able to ask the right questions, to be able to find solutions, give them ways to do that.
And the stepping back process is often very challenging for
Yes.
families.
Yes.
I hear this often when people have gone through an illness episode and there's a lot of involvement from various professionals, PT, care managers, physicians. When people step back out of that acuity, there's often a real adjustment in the family system as they're having to renegotiate and reintegrate those roles.
It makes me think that people often say, well, what would you do? And I don't know if that resonates with either of you, because I explain I'm not in the situation and I can't make a decision for you.
Right.
Is that?
Of course,
Yes.
right.
So let's just explore a little bit about the Mike Kennedy segment that appeared on this episode of Connecting the Dots. Just to summarize, I interviewed Mike. Mike is a local Worcester County resident. He's middle-aged. I will not divulge his age, but he is middle-aged. But he suffered his spinal cord injury when he was a youth. And I was curious to get your opinion as a psychologist and your opinion as and I'm going to not call you the appropriate thing, Rebecca.
No, that's okay.
But in your expertise, if Mike were now to have suffered this injury as a middle-aged man as opposed to a youth, what would each of you recommend be part of his life care plan? If, and perhaps I'm getting ahead of myself, if Mike was currently 14 when he suffered the injury, but if he was now 14 and he was suffering this, what would you recommend? How would you get his family, and who would you recommend be part of this team? So.
So he's a 14-year-old suffering the injury?
Yes, let's start with the
Okay,
14. Yeah, let's start with the 14.
And let me just jump in, because earlier I had wanted to comment that I think there's a difference between whatever's happening in the crisis and then that ability for them to do long-term planning. And I think you can't long-term plan in the midst of crisis. And I think perhaps sometimes that's what we can do behind the scenes, is we can start that planning process. A care manager can do that. You be present in that moment and handle the relationships. Let us do the work behind the scenes, because you're going to need this, but you're not going to be able to do it in the midst of crisis. They're just going to be thinking one day at a time, one doctor's appointment at a time, one rehab hospital at a time. That's
right. And one of the things that I think is important is, from a psychological perspective, is to be aware of the different developmental points in a life where there's a life transition. We're likely to see different needs and have different requirements when somebody's at 14 and living at home compared to, he talked about going to UMass Amherst and being able to function independently there. I know a lot of kids who go to UMass Amherst who don't have issues and have trouble
challenges.
trouble focusing. Not
Laundry.
college. Yeah, exactly. So how do we put things in place to make these normal lifespan transitions, which will be more complex as a result of the physical disability or injury or diagnosis? How do we facilitate that for them? Anticipate it and then facilitate it. So going to college, coming home, getting a first job, getting married, parenting, all of these things that are normal in a life and we want people to be able to do as normally as possible. being able to anticipate glitches in that might make that complex for them.
And prolonging their dependence could look like love, but it really isn't,
Right.
because it's not equipping them to move forward. And often at the spectrum where I might see someone who may have had this injury early in life and maybe never separated from family, or maybe you have someone with Down syndrome, someone who has an adult disability and they live with their often mother for a long time, and then mom in her 80s has been abandoned by the rest of the family. Either husband died or children can no longer stand the amount of work and care that goes into having someone with disabilities, and they're not available, and mom falls. And all of a sudden you now have two people who are in crisis, because when mom falls, now you have that son or daughter who's never ever really assimilated or had any kind of other social supports than mom. So you end up in a crisis. So if you go back 50 years or 80 years to have been able to do it right, whatever right is, but it's to be able to allow that person on a trajectory that's more normal so that they have a good web of supports.
I'm just, I'm fascinated by this, but how do you counsel a parent with a child who has been afflicted from birth and never emancipated because of an inability to emancipate? How do you counsel them that there's going to come a point in time, parent, that you are not going to be here, and what is the best option for your child? And maybe, Betsy, it's appropriate for me to ask you that.
Yeah, I think so.
I think you just articulated it very well, which is we need to deal in reality. There will be a time where something will change. And I think it's important for us to be able to be planning for that next thing, that next transition, as people are moving through their, again, typical lifespan development. Because we don't want that crisis, if we can avoid that in any way. So.
And again, just to jump in as a lawyer, I feel that conversation needs to be subtly introduced, even if the child is an infant or a toddler, or even if the affliction has occurred to a youth, that the parent is not going to be there, infinitely. And so, but again, as you pointed out, Rebecca, so often we're going to man up and we're going to do this, and we're not going to, no one is going to deter us, and it is couched in this, I have to do this for my loved one, with extremely dire consequences.
Oh, absolutely.
To the family.
I see a lot of caregivers in my practice, and we bump up against this all the time. It's important for you to take care of your own needs, your own identity, your own health, as we're moving through our own life process, when we're coping with a family member who has an illness or disability. So that self-sacrificing model just isn't sustainable for most people when we're talking about decades.
Right, that's right. And people will live decades now. Right. That is a reality. People will live longer with disabilities that years ago would have ended their life early, but they will live longer now. We have better medicine. We have better ways of caring for people. We have better prosthetics that are going to help people who need to have artificial limbs. Everything is better, but therefore that means a longer life and a longer period of caregiving until we understand a different way to do caregiving, or being a care partner, which is a term you and I we've all talked about. What does a partnership look like? That it's not totally about one serving the other, but it's about learning how to support each other in whatever way that's possible. What I think is interesting is each of us have to have that person be present with us for conversation, though, and it's less likely that I would have a conversation with someone who needs to do that. I think attorneys are well placed, mostly because we have legal matters that we have to deal with in life. And I imagine you're the first person who would be able to entertain a conversation with a family and bring it up over and over and over again until it sticks. Right. And then they're coming to us usually in crisis. Something has fallen apart, or something is just not working anymore, and then we can be part of that conversation.
But I and thank you for the opportunity to to expound on this, but as a lawyer, I'm always encouraging people not to plan in crisis, because that's when people do plan.
That's right.
Or fail to plan,
Right.
when something happens and they observe it from afar or nearby, and they say, that's not going to happen to me.
Right.
A lot of it can be avoided, and I'm sure in each of your practices, a lot could be avoided if people simply, bit the bullet and said, okay, I need to do this. I need to have something in place, even if it's basic. I need to have something in place. But inevitably, that's the unusual client. And I would say here, Mike is probably the unusual spinal cord injury. And if both of you could comment about that as well, having viewed the video.
Well, one of the things I mentioned to you is that he's almost pathologically normal, in the way he's gone through his lifespan development. The spinal cord injury has been a variable he's had to negotiate with, but he's done that very directly and very successfully. There's no denial going on here for him at all, and he's been able to adapt quite effectively, and had a job and had a marriage, and has done some very interesting work as a result.
And almost a career path.
Very much so.
Right.
Right.
And Rebecca, what would your comments?
I concur. I think we all agreed when we understood his way that he's dealt with what happened to him. It's incredibly positive, and I'm sure he's had low moments, but that doesn't always come out necessarily in an interview. But I think we were talking earlier about resilience. You're not born with that, and I would suggest he probably had pretty empowering parents or people who were around him. At the time this occurred, he was in middle school, like worst time of life, and yet somehow he was supported and given the tools to be able to make this be the life that he's going to live, and he's living it fully. He's living fully into his life, which is the best you'd want for anybody. And that just, I think, and he could have even had a terrible parenting situation, and there's still something about him that seems like he's got an innate ability to bounce, which all of us would love to have, and some of us just don't have that, and so I think that's more the conversation, is to find people who are able to rise above that and see it like one more thing, but we're here to help the people who can't do that as well.
Exactly. Well, I wanted to comment as well that, as Betsy said, Mike is not in denial. Mike has, to my way of thinking, he's accepted it, and that so often I see people don't accept it.
Right.
They shrink back instead of saying, okay, this is where I am now. I'm going to go forward from here, as opposed to lamenting the past.
The backward look.
Right. So again, we all three seem to be saying that in our practices, this is an unusual situation. So what is the usual situation that you see? Again, crisis-driven, obviously. Is it the parents? Is it the grandparents? Is it someone who is calling you to become involved? Is it another professional that's calling you to become involved? What, if you can just give me a little thumbnail of a typical, if this can be called a typical scenario.
I'm not sure we can identify a really typical scenario, but
right.
People come into my practice in all of those ways, either referred by physicians or by attorneys or by care managers.
Yes.
Because they're identifying difficulties that somebody's having in terms of finding their resilience or being flexible in the face of challenges. I tend to see people who don't do what Mike does as the nature of my practice. So when I see somebody like that, it's really quite remarkable. So no, people come in through all different venues.
All different portals.
We probably don't get to see the mics.
We don't.
Because I think we are in the professions where people need to have more help and more answers or more support, and he's probably been able to get that, and even if he had relationships with us, they're probably pretty short-lived, because he is able to do it again, to be able to get up again. I think for me, my clients often are not the ones who reach out to me personally, although sometimes they are, and I'm so amazed by people who say, I'm all alone, I'm going to live this much longer, I need to have a conversation that helps me plan for the future. More often, and that's very deliberate and very planned, and might be similar to how Mike does things, that he's able to do that. But more often than not, I see not the caregiver, but I see the next layer calling me and saying, I'm watching the caregiver burn themselves out.
Right.
Okay.
And often I find myself, I'm not going in to help the original person, I'm going in to help the caregiver, because we have to save that caregiver. Because we spoke earlier, I don't know that the disease requirement should be afflicted upon 2 people or a whole family. We have to try to help that caregiver be able to return to a semblance of a life that's not just about caregiving, that it's about living the life they're meant to live also. So often there's a third party. There's a child, there's a niece, there's a nephew, there's a doctor, there's an attorney, a financial person who's saying, this system is going to self-destruct if we can't get some answers and be able to put some solutions into place. But they do come in. Everybody's different.
Exactly. They
Which
come in
is
different
really
ways and
interesting.
everybody's
2 things you said, the financial aspect, but also, is there a reticence to pay for advice?
Yes.
Okay, that was.
How quickly would you like that?
Yeah, exactly.
We don't pay for anything here in America. We have insurance.
Exactly.
We're shocked at co-pays. We're shocked when they're getting higher. We're reluctant to even pay them, to say nothing of paying privately. And that's, for me, in my industry, almost 100% of the time, that's a private pay situation, which should translate to the person who's hiring you to understand, I work just for you. I don't work for an insurance company. I don't work for your doctor's office or any other provider. I'm here for you.
So it's customized as opposed
It
to
is.
right.
However,
Okay.
that customization
Right.
requires that there's a check written.
Right. And again, Betsy, I want to give you an opportunity to respond, but do you also find that people say, well, I'll skip that aspect of it because I have a relative.
I can go online.
Right, I can utilize it. Is that how, is that your experience as well?
My experience is a little different. I do take insurance in my practice, so although I am working for the client as well,
Right.
the payer is often a third-party payer. And in this part of the state, that's the culture, is to try to use insurance for covering these kinds of costs.
But do people actually say to you, insurance will pay for so much, so I only want you to give this much advice because
I don't tend to see as much of that.
Okay,
And
all
I think you both of you are going to see more of that than I will. Yeah.
I only want the low budget version. I don't want
But she's probably already built a relationship with them enough, I would suggest, that you probably don't have that cost conversation in the early stages. Do you? You have it pretty
You
early.
have to.
Because I'm wondering if, as they receive benefit from you and that you're coming to the end of the time together based on what insurance would reimburse, they might be able to, it's the long sales talk in a way that they're receiving a benefit. And that also happens in my case also, is that by the time you built the relationship, then about the cost is a little less than when they're shopping, when it first starts to be the shopping period of time.
Well, and again, now I'm going back to you're saying shopping. If people are in crisis, aren't they
Desperate?
Yeah, desperate, yes, yes. Well, a lovely conversation, ladies. Thank you so much. I would love to continue this at a future date. But for now, I want you to remember, I'm Lizbeth Myska, your trusted advisor. Thank you for watching Connecting the Dots.
Please note that the information provided in this show is not a substitute for consulting with an experienced local attorney and receiving counsel based on the facts and circumstances of a particular transaction. To contact Lizbeth, email her at lizbeth@elizabethlmyska.com or call her office at 508-753-7681. We're online at connectingthedots.lawyer. Executive producers, Lizbeth Myska and Jack Peacock. Producers, John Medberry and Bill Hamilton. A production of Elizabeth L. Myska, JD, LLM, in association with Compliments.